Before we move further into the section and talk about how to create multiple reducers, let's first try to understand that why do we need multiple reducers? Well, technically speaking, you really don't need multiple reducers because in the end, all the reducers are joined together to form one reducer. And our code is working perfectly fine with one reducer. I think the problem is going to come into play when you are dealing with multiple slices of the state. Right now, the only thing in the state that you have is a counter, but let's just assume that we have something called movies. And movies is an array of string. In an actual application, it will be an array of model object movies. And what we want to do is we want to get all the movies. So how do we get all the movies? Well, we will go over here and create an action. We will say get movies action. This will be of type action. And you will pass in the movies to it like this. Now we will go to our reducer and we will check for that particular action as movies action or get movies action. If it is get movies action, we will go ahead and update that particular state. So we might be getting all the movies from some API and we are simply updating the state. And I can say action.movies. Perfect. And this works perfectly fine. But consider this, that if you're doing this for every single model or every single scenario that you have in your app, you're getting the movies, you're adding the movies, you're deleting the movies, you're maybe fetching the favorite books, you're getting the books, deleting the books, updating books, you're doing a lot of stuff, and this particular function will get much bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And now this function is doing a lot of work. Basically, this reducer will be responsible for updating the counter state, which is here, and the movie state, and maybe the book state, and the user state, and so on. So one reducer now has a lot of responsibility. It will be a good idea to divide that reducer into multiple reducers. So maybe we can have something called a counter reducer, which only manages this slice of the state, whose job is to update the counter state. Maybe we can have a movies reducer whose job is to update the movie state, and that's it, and anything else related to the movies. Doing this will going to divide the work, and instead of having one reducer doing the work for everyone, now we will have multiple reducers, each responsible for part of the work. And that is the main thing about multiple reducers, that we will end up creating multiple reducers who are updating portion or slices of the global state. So now that you have a little bit of idea of why do we require multiple reducers, let's go ahead in the next lecture create multiple reducers. All right, so now that you understand the purpose of multiple reducers, let's go ahead and get started with creating multiple reducers. Now, you can create your reducers right inside the store.swift file, or you can even create it outside of the store.swift file. I can go to my stored folder and I can go ahead and create a new folder called reducers. And we can move all of our new reducers inside this file. So I'm going to go ahead and first of all add a reducer that is going to be responsible for updating the state of the counter. And it is only related, its only job is to update the state and manage the state of the counter. So your global state can contain counter is authentication stuff, some tasks, some movies, but the counter reducer is only trying to manage the actual counter global state and nothing else, that small slice of the state. I'm going to make sure it's also added to the Mac OS because this is Xcode 12 and we are in a shared environment, meaning a shared folder. So all of these files will be shared among iOS as well as macOS applications. So there we go. We created our first file. Oops. And it's called counter reducer. Now, just because it's a counter reducer.swift file doesn't mean that the reducer has now changed. It's still a reducer is a function that takes in a state and it returns the updated state. So we can actually copy paste everything that we have from the previous reducer. So let's go over here. You can see this was counter reducer, right? I mean, all of the stuff that this was doing was actually the purpose and the job of counter reducer: incrementing action, decrementing action, and add action. So let's go ahead and simply copy this and go to counter reducer and paste it. Now, obviously, we want it to be called counter reducer, so we will simply change the name of the reducer to be counter reducer. Perfect. So this will be our first reducer, and this reducer will only update the counter state. Right now you can see that this reducer is not only managing counter state, this reducer is managing the global state. We will have to change that a little bit later on, but at least we have our counter reducer. The next reducer that we are going to create will be the app reducer. So let's go ahead and create a file. App reducer. Now, if you're doing or you're coming from a background of React and Redux and JavaScript, then the app reducer is our root reducer. This means that this reducer will contain other reducers. So let's go ahead and implement this. App reducer. Once again, it's an app reducer, but it will also perform something on a state, and it will return you a state. The state right now in the counter reducer is a global state. We don't really want to do that. We will have to eventually change that to a particular slice of the state that we want to update. But right now, we don't have that slice of the state that we're talking about. So we're just going to leave it as a state. So this is the definition you can see for the app reducer, which is pretty much the same as the counter reducer. We will go ahead and also return a particular state. Now, right now, the problem is that we don't really have, well, states. The state is only the global state, which is declared right over here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create state, the slice of the state that will represent a counter reducer, and we also need to create a state that is going to represent the app state. So we can have an app state, we can have a counter state, we can have a task state or movie state, and so on. So let's go to the next lecture and see that how we can get started with creating the states. Now, since we'll be creating multiple states, it's a good idea to create some sort of a protocol that all the states can actually use. So I'm going to go ahead and create a protocol, and I will call it Redux state. This means that every single state that you will create, whether it is a counter state or app state or movie state, they all have to conform to the Redux state. We will also not be using state. We will update that so that this will become the app state. Now, this is the app state, which can contain other states, and one of the other states that it will have will be the counter state. So I'm going to go ahead and create a structure for counter state. The app state as well as the counter state will be conforming to the Redux state. So let's go ahead and do that also. Now, the job of the counter state is to update only the counter. Its only concern is to update the counter value. So let's go ahead and put the counter inside over here, and we will remove it from the app state. And we will add the counter state inside the app state, and we will initialize it. You can already see that it's actually giving some issues over here because now there is no more state. In order to create a reducer of a particular state, we will make this type alias a generic argument of state. This means that when you're creating a reducer, you can pass in that, hey, I'm only looking for a counter state, or I'm only looking for a app state. Now, this state should also belong to the Redux state, so you can also conform to that if you want to. Let's go ahead and remove this reducer portion because we don't really need this anymore. We have moved all of this logic to somewhere else. And we will also make sure that this will be a Redux state. Okay. Now, obviously, when we go to the store is actually complaining because the store is saying that, well, you're using this type alias, but you need to provide the generic argument. This means that whenever we're creating the store, we can say that the store state that you're going to be providing will be Redux state. And now we can ask the reducer, and we can tell the reducer that this will be a stored state. And the same thing with the actual state or that we are creating, we can say it will be of type stored state, whatever the state the person has said that this is going to be. And this is going to be again true for everywhere that we are using the reducer. So we are simply going to change this to stored state, which is the state that the user is going to set when they are creating the store, and stored state over here. And we can go ahead and remove the state part. Let's go ahead and build it. Now we have a lot of issues over here. You can actually see that it's not really building correctly. If we go over here into our app reducer, you can see the couple of different problems that we're facing. We don't really have anything called state anymore, but the app reducer will be working on the app state. So maybe we can change this to app state, and it will return you the app state. Because the reducer is only working on a particular state. Let's go ahead and build this. The same thing you will find a problem when you are in the counter reducer. We will go ahead and update this to a counter state, and we will make sure that it actually returns you a counter state. Now we can still see that there are a lot of errors, and to be really honest, you don't have to worry about fixing all the errors yourself. If you go ahead and download the attached resources, then you will find that I have fixed all the errors, and you can download a copy with no errors. Okay, but let's go ahead and click over here. You can see that over here it's saying that there is no reducer. We have to specify when we are injecting something in the Hello Redux app that whether this will be the app reducer or a counter reducer. So I'm going to go ahead and simply say it's going to be a app reducer. So I'm just going to pass in app reducer. Okay. Now the second argument that is missing is the state. And once again, I'm going to fire in, or I'm going to pass in the app state, because that will be the root state which can contain other states. Now we still have a lot of errors to deal with. Let's go ahead and check it out. Now, since we have created our store, if we scroll down and we check out the actual implementation of the store, since we have now used generic arguments, we have to specify what kind of a store we are trying to build over here. Now, I am inside the content view, but we already know that when you are injecting the stuff, we are injecting the app state. So this will be kind of like the root state or the parent state. So inside the content view, I'm going to specify that I will be using the app state. That is kind of like our root state of the app. Now, right now we're inside the content view, which has a function called map. I'm going to go ahead and update this also. The content view is mostly interested in the counter. So, well, first of all, there is no such thing as state. I can go ahead and put app state over here, But I'm going to put counter state because that is a state the content view is interested in. Let's go ahead and build now. Now we have to make sure that the state that we are sending will be the correct one. So if I go ahead and say state, you can see it's app state dot counter state. So now we are sending in the counter state. Now if we scroll down over here, you can see that we are sending in a reducer when we are generating a store. Since I'm inside the content view, which is mostly interested in the counter reducer, so I can probably pass in over here a counter reducer. Go ahead and save it. And the other state that I'm going to pass in will be the counter state. And there we go. So now we have created a different reducer, which is called the counter reducer. And we have also created an app reducer. But you can see right now that the app reducer is not really doing much. I mean, it simply gets the state and it assigns the state to a new variable and then returns the state. So app reducer can actually take help from the counter reducer to update the state. So I can say over here state, which is app state, dot counter state, which is another slice of the state, which is a counter state. And we can simply go ahead and call counter reducer, passing in the state, which is state.counterState, and also the action, which is we can simply pass in action. Now we know from definition of a reducer that this is going to return you the updated state of counter state, which is later assigned to the app state counter state property. And this is how you will create multiple reducers. So let's go ahead and run the app to see what we have accomplished by creating multiple reducers. And here is our app. It is running. And you can see that the counter state is still working correctly, and I can perform all of those different operations. Now, in reality, we did created multiple reducers, but there is only one counter reducer and one app reducer, which is a global state. In the next few lectures, you will learn that how you can create a completely separate reducer which updates a different portion, different slice of the state. If you look at the store that we have created, you can see that our main slice of the state, the actual content, is the counter state. So in the next lecture, we'll be working with task reducer, which will update task state. So a different slice of the global state. So let's go ahead and see how we can accomplish that. All right, so now let's go ahead and get started with building our task reducer. Now, in order for our task reducer to work, we should have a slice of the state which will represent the task. I'm going to go over here in the store file and create a new structure that is going to represent the slice of the state. We're going to call it task state. This is going to be conforming to the protocol, which is Redux state. And it will have a list of tasks. But right now, we don't have any model, any class to represent a single task. So I can go ahead and add a new group, and we will call it models. In this models folder, I can go ahead and add a task file, which is going to represent a single task. And I'm going to make sure that we are making it enabled for the iOS target as well as the macOS target. This can be a structure called task. Whenever you want to create a task, you should pass in a title of a particular task. Now, the task can also have other properties if you want. That's perfectly fine, but we're just keeping it very simple. Let's go back to our store. And now we can go ahead and change this to task, which is an array of task models or task class, which is actually a structure. So this is our task model. The other thing that we need to do is we need some person to update the task. Just like we have the counter reducer, which is only concerned about updating the counter state, we should have some sort of a reducer for a task that will be responsible for updating the task state. And we would like to also add the task right over here in our app state. The app state is the global state, which contains some other slices of the state. So I can go ahead and create task state, which will be a task state. Now let's go ahead and create a task reducer. Now over here you can see that we have to pass in something because we're calling it like this. So we can actually go ahead and initialize it with an empty array. Now in the reducers, I can go ahead and add a new file. Next, and I can call this task reducer. And this will be responsible for maintaining the task. It's going to go exactly, or it's going to be exactly like the counter reducer. So I'm just going to copy the counter reducer, but obviously the name will be changed to task reducer. Also, this particular task reducer is going to be working against the task, not the counter state. So this means we have to change this and this to reflect that it is working on the task state and not the counter state. So someone will pass in the task state and it is going to return you the updated task state. Okay, so this is our task reducer, but as you can see that it doesn't really update anything. We can go ahead and perform a switch on an action. And we realize that, well, we don't really have any action. So I'm going to go back to my store. And for this, you can create separate files for action. I'm just keeping it simple and adding everything in the store, but you can keep it if the actions are kind of like getting out of control. It will be a much better idea to create separate files, one for like action creators and all this stuff. Increment or struct, we will say add task action, which is going to be action. Now, one of the special things about add task action is that you can pass in a particular task. So task, this is what you have to pass in. And since this is a structure, it will automatically have the constructor, the initializer, which will allow you to pass a single task. Now we can go back to our task reducer and perform a case statement. If we try to convert this, let's say let action as add task action, and if we are able to convert it or cast it successfully, then we should be able to access the value of this particular action, which will be hopefully be action.task. Now, what should we do once we have that value? We can take the state, which is a task state, dot task dot append, and append the new task, which is inside the action. We should also have a default case over here. So I'm just going to say default, and in the default case, we're simply going to go ahead and break. And there you go. This is your task action or task reducer that we have created. And in the next lecture, we'll be looking at that how we can utilize our counter reducer and how we can utilize our new task reducer so that we can start adding some tasks. Now, before we jump on to the next video, I do want to talk about Azam Sharp School, which is one of the largest catalogs for iOS development. I mean, check out these courses. If you simply click on the courses, you'll get a list of 22 plus courses. All of these courses are extremely intricately created for you. They all have hands-on exercises. I mean, look at these courses over here. Test-driven development. You have server-driven UI, Swift Data Bootcamp, MV design pattern, full stack iOS development, reactive programming, and much more. Now, you can pay the individual price, as you can see, $69, $89, or what most people end up doing, they just become a pro member. they get access to everything, all 22 plus courses, 130 hours of content, and more. So the best route for you is to just become a pro and get access to everything. All right, so that's it. Check out azamsharp.school, and I'm sure you're going to love it. Now let's go back to the video. All right, so in the last lecture, we implemented the task reducer. Let's go ahead and create a view where we can add an actual task. I'm going to go ahead and start by creating some sort of a variable, session variable, which is basically a state variable. And this will allow us to open up a presentation sheet in a modal. So I'm just going to call it is presented, Boolean, and we will initialize it with false. All right. Okay. Now let's go into our view, and you can see that in our view we have a increment button, we have the counter button, we have decrement, and we have add button. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and add another button, which is add task. Now obviously this all app doesn't really make that much sense. We have increment button and decrement button and add task button, but keep in mind that we are trying to learn how the whole framework, all the moving parts actually work. I'm also going to go ahead and add a little bit of a spacer over here so that my task is, or add task is displayed over there. And let's go ahead and see if I put a spacer right over here. Okay, that's perfectly fine. I can actually go ahead and do this also so that everything is kind of like in the center. Okay, much better. Now, when you press the add task button, we are going to go ahead and change the property is presented to true, which means that we want the modal sheet to get displayed. Now, right now, we don't really have any modal, so let's go ahead and create that. So I'm going to go right over here, which is the edge of the VStack, and going to add a sheet function, going to be passing is presented, which in this case will be is presented, which is a bindable property. And for content, right now, I'm just going to pass a text view, which I will call add task view, just so that we can see that it is getting displayed or not. Let's go ahead and review it. I'm going to go ahead and press on the preview button. I'm going to go ahead and say add task, and there we go. Perfect. So it is definitely working, but obviously our add task is just simply a text view and nothing else. So let's go and add another control. We're going to go ahead and add a SwiftUI view. I will call this task or add task view. Add task view is fine. And it is of type SwiftUI view. And if you want, you can make it available in our other part, which is the macOS application. So if you select on this file, you can make sure it is already added. You can actually see. Oops, I'm not sure what happened over here. Okay, so I guess Xcode has some weird plugin. Okay, let me see actually what's going on. Okay, there we go. Right here, we have actually added. Okay, so that's always good to see that it is part of the Mac system. Now, our add task view doesn't really display much. So what we want to do is we want to display some sort of a text field, and we want to, when the person adds a task, we want to show it in a list. Now, all the values from the text field are going to go into some sort of a variable. So I'm just going to create a name variable over here, which will be of type string, and I will initialize it with empty string. Now in the body, I can go ahead and create a VStack, a vertical stack. I will go ahead and create a text field. And for the text field, I'm going to say enter task. And for the text, it will be a bindable to the name. All right. Let's go ahead and resume this to see our text field, hopefully. So this is our text field, perfectly fine. You can arrange it in a different way if you want to. I mean, we can say text field style, and I believe you can say rounded border text field style. You can even add a little bit of more padding to your VStack. There we go. And finally, we can even add some sort of a button, which can say add. There we go. And since this is inside the vlist, I can put a spacer and everything can go on the top. Okay, so that's pretty basic UI that we have created. What we want to do is when you press the button, the value in the text field using Redux pattern is going to be dispatched using action. It's going to go to the reducer and it will end up in the task state. So how can we do that? All right. Now, if you go to the content view, you can see that we started out with creating our environment object and we were using the app state. So we can use the same exact approach for using the app state. Now I'm going to go over here and copy this part. And let's go back to our add view. App state is fine. Now I also need to inject it over here or else it's not going to work. So store, and we are going to be creating a particular store. So just like we did over here in the content view, you can see that we ended up creating a store. We will create a store over here. And we're passing it the app state. And we are setting it or injecting the environment, passing in the store. There we go. Okay, so we have the store. What we want to do is we want the person to dispatch an action. And for that, we're going to go ahead and create the same thing, which is props. But this time, the props are going to work for adding a particular task and also displaying a list of tasks. So we have a couple of dispatch options over here. And I will begin with on task added, whose value or which will be of type. So basically we're using the same exact structure over here. You can see that we are creating these kind of dispatch actions right here. So if I go back to my over here, I can say, let's call it var. And we are going to be adding a task. It's not going to be returning anything. Okay. So this is our dispatch action that we want to perform. Now, when we call, we have to also implement the map function. So let's go ahead and implement map. And in the map, you will pass in the state. The state will be of type task state. There we go. And this is going to return you the props, the local props. And now we can go ahead and return something. So we can return props. You can see the props takes in on task added. And for over here, we are going to get a task. And once we do get the task, we can go ahead and call something, which will be store.dispatch. And we can dispatch an action. We can say add task action, passing in the task. Right? Let's go ahead and build this. Okay, so this is great. This means that our task will be sent, will be dispatched using the action. The add task action is going to take place, which means it is going to go to the dispatch right here in the store. It is going to dispatch an action to probably the task reducer, which is going to append and update the store and only the slice of the store, which is the task array. Now let's go back. So this may be able to update the task, but we still have to figure out how to get all the tasks and make sure that you are calling this function somewhere over here when we are adding or we are pressing the add button. So I'm going to go over here in the body, and first of all, I'm going to go ahead and create the props, and I will go ahead and say map state to props. We have to pass in the task state. So store dot state dot task state, and make sure that you have a return. Now we can go ahead and say props dot on task added, and we can go ahead and just call that function. Now, one of the things that we need to do over here is that on task added actually does take in a task. So you have to create the task at least. So we will go ahead and create a task. So task takes in a title, which apparently we already have because we are sending the value that we type in the text box. So we are actually creating that. And there we go. We can now send in a task. Let's go ahead and send it like this. Perfect. So this is going to allow us to at least add a new task, but we still need to display all the tasks. That's not a big deal because we will simply jump into our props and over here, and we are going to go ahead and create a property called task, which is of type task array. There we go. We can even actually move this to let, I believe, and we'll see if it allows us to use let, then we can use let, or else we'll change it to post. Let's see what's going on over here. Now we are missing one argument. We do have to pass in task, and we can ask the state dot task. Isn't that great? Now we can go ahead and display it whatever we want. So I can go over here and I can say list, which is props.tasks. Now I do want to get something identifiable and I don't really have it. So right now we can go ahead and say kind of like this, and we can say title, I believe. Title of the task or the name of the task, whatever the property is. We will hopefully get a task object back, and we can go ahead and display task.title. Now, in your actual application, I would suggest using something a little bit more unique, but right now we're just using this. Actually, if we go back to the task object, you can see that we can go ahead and create a property called ID over here and simply assign it some sort of a value, UUID or something, so that we always have some sort of ID. Now I will go back to my add task view and use an ID over here. All right. Okay. Now let's go ahead and give it a run. We are going to run our application and going to try to add a task. The task is going to perform a dispatch, which is going to reach the task reducer, which in turn is going to allow us to perform the update on the slice of the state. So let's go ahead and resume this. And let's go ahead and run this. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a task. Let's say mow the lawn, and adding a task. Okay, so right now we can definitely see it's not getting displayed. So let's go ahead and see what exactly is the problem. All right, so if you go back to the app reducer, you can see that we updated the slice of the state for the counter state, but we never really updated the state or the slice of the state which is designated for the task state. So let's go ahead and do that. State.taskState equals to task reducer, passing in the slice of the state, which is task state, and passing in the action. Right? Let's go ahead and build this. And let's go ahead and jump into our add task view and resume our application and see if we can actually add a particular task using the Redux pattern that we have been learning. So we'll just wait for this preview to load. By the way, I have updated my Xcode. It is now Xcode 12, the GM version. All right, so let's go ahead and run it. I'm going to go ahead and say over here, mow the lawn, and I will add it. And there we go. We have actually added an item to our store. As soon as the item is added to the global state using the global store, it throws a notification allowing our view to load. I'm just going to say feed the rabbit. I'm saying feed the rabbit because now we have a rabbit, so that's why. And let's say clean dishes, and there we go. So everything seems to be working fine. And now we have multiple reducer. One reducer job is to update the counter state, and one reducer job is to update the task state. So there you have it, multiple reducers in Redux using SwiftUI.